My name is Sabina Dewan, and I'm the President and Executive Director of the Just Jobs Network. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all here today for this series that Just Jobs Network is hosting, part of a future of work in the Global South. Just Jobs Network has been working on these issues for quite a while now, on the issues of skills and human capital development. The more we become witness to change induced by not just technology, but also phenomena like the restructuring of trade into value chains, climate change, migration, urbanization, and of course, the big one, which is the pandemic. As these different forces restructure labor markets, resilience among societies and among people really comes from the investments we make in them. And skills and education and creating a continuum from education to skills to employability and labor force entry is fundamentally important, particularly for many countries in the Global South that have large and growing youth populations. So with that, thank you to CIPPEC, who is our Argentinian counterpart, who Just Jobs has the opportunity to work with among other regional partners, and CIPPEC is also leading this program, and my colleague Ramiro will tell you a little bit more about that. But we're also, Just Jobs Network is very grateful to all of our esteemed panelists for being here today. So with that, let me introduce Ramiro Albaru, who's the principal researcher on economic development within CIPPEC and is the leading coordinator of the FOIGS initiative. So Ramiro, take it away.
Thanks, Sabina. Good afternoon or good morning for me in Buenos Aires. I'm really excited to be here and listen to you, to your knowledge about skills and the future of work. I'm going to take just a few minutes to give you an overview of our initiative, the future of work in the Global South. That is an initiative financed by the IDRC, the Canadian Cooperation Agency. We have been working on trying to create new knowledge and bring new data on the future of work topic. And for the last, 5 years maybe. And so we have been producing new pieces of research and data and so on. But eventually we realized that we were missing like the big picture, of if we were talking about our real challenges, our real issues in the Global South. So we decided to rethink our project in order to get truly Global South visions or frameworks about the future of work. That's why we start these dialogues where researchers and academics and institutions from Global South regions start trying to think together on what the future of work is in our regions. We had our dialogues in Sub-Saharan Africa, then in Latin America, then in the Middle East and North Africa, and now finally in Asia. And our idea is to produce maybe a volume or first a global vision on the future of work, then a Global South vision, and then a regional vision on the future of work. Our main, we can say, incentive to do that is that we are seeing that there's a global narrative that is filling all the discussion arena. In this global narrative, we have this view that is kind of optimistic about technology, saying that eventually, we will manage to reskill our population, to rethink labor market institution. And so we will have a new equilibrium, we can say, with new tech, new skills, new institutions. And in a way, this narrative that has to do mainly with global North history, is also feeding policy frameworks in the global South. And in a way, in our countries, we have a different history, of missing opportunities. So in a way, global North is thinking about how to repeat history, and we need to do things differently this time. You need to think in our own terms. So our main question was, okay, this global narrative fits our context, in each one of our regions. So that's why we start these dialogues. And in a way, the idea is not to, again, produce a new piece of research, but to systematize, to compile, to order what's out there in order to feed, our own visions, our own policy frameworks. So the idea is to have maybe overview, an outlook of the region in each one of the topics, in order to have we can say, proper narratives, proper visions that maybe do not antagonize with the global North vision, but just to add context, diversity, our own structure, our own challenges, our own opportunities. So we are trying to think about the future of work through, first, this global South lens, but second, to trying to merge different branches of knowledge. So we have roundtables on technology, roundtables on skills, roundtables on demographics, on labor market institutions, on inequality. In a way, we know that we are all working on the future of work issue, but just seeing one part of the problem, So also our plan is trying to merge, trying to think all these different branches of knowledge, but trying to think them together, as a system. So again, I'm really happy to be here, and I give the floor to Mega, who will start this very exciting conversation. Mega?
Thank you so much, Ramiro. Thank you for that introduction to 2-4 As you rightly said, I think conversations around the Global South need to be rooted in the reality that we have here. So hello, everyone, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this discussion on building education and skills in a time of demographic change. And these are narratives from Asia. My name is Megha Srinivasan. I'm the Operations and Development Lead at the Just Jobs Network, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. So adding to the context that both Sabina and Ramiro have set, with respect to today's session, we spoke about technological change, and that by itself is highlighting the need for education reform. It's looking at acquisition of relevant skills, the importance of learning, relearning, how to perform tasks in a constantly changing, technological as well as a demographic environment. But we also do recognize that cultivating education and skills without connecting these processes to market demand seems to be counterproductive. So what this panel really aims to do is to discuss, what are the skills that are in demand? How are training programs connecting with the industry? How do you build a training ecosystem that can adapt to a constantly changing world of work? And specifically, it will hone in on the need for skills and training practices across Asia toward informing narratives on skills development from the Global South. And for the discussion today, we have the pleasure of having some of the most respected voices from across the globe to throw light on some of these issues. So allow me to introduce the first speaker for today, Ms. Susana Puerto Gonzalez. Susana is a senior youth employment specialist at the International Labour Organization. She coordinates the global initiative on decent jobs for youth, an action-oriented partnership platform for the promotion of youth employment. She has over 12 years of experience on labor market analysis and evaluations of skills development and active labor market measures with a focus on youth. A very warm welcome to you, Susana. And she will kickstart the discussion today with a presentation to share an overview of skills training in Asia against the backdrop of a constantly changing labor market and demographic change. So over to you, Susana.
Thank you very much, Megan. And hello, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. Megan, let me know if you can see it. Yes, great, thanks. So, thanks again for the invitation to the ILO to join this event. It is a pleasure to be here with you. So I think your introduction was perfect, Mega, because it really gives me a good landing to what I wanted to share with you. First of all, I'll focus on young people, thinking about that demographic change and also bringing the technological change in mind. And I will frame our conversation about not only, let's say, how both that demographic change, but also technology are shaping labor markets today. So let me move to the next slide here. So here now we have, obviously, COVID has stalled lots of the progress that had been done in the recent past, especially as regards to youth employment. And while young people are always heavily impacted by economic recessions, this time it's worse in terms of the size and the speed of the economic impact, but also in terms of the extent to which young people are disproportionately affected. So based on the country level data at our disposal, and I should say that Sabina asked me to compare Global North and Global South, but nowadays, not all the Global South has the latest information on how COVID impacted those labor markets. So I have to say this is a partial view of what that, especially the Global South, what we mean by the Global South. This information comes from about 50 countries that reported labor force surveys for 2020. So with that, let's say, caveat, let me just say that we estimated a fall in global youth employment by 8.7% in 2020 compared to 3.7% among adults. Young women experience greater employment losses, particularly in Latin America. And so some of our questions is, where did the employment losses go? So sometimes we think that all employment losses go immediately into unemployment, but it rather turns out that most of the young people that are not longer employed enter into a situation of inactivity. This means that they are not actively looking for a job, which is a very serious issue because it's also connected to discouragement, it is connected to detachment from the labor market, it is connected to mental issues, mental well-being issues, and other range of situations that we see young people facing today, in addition, let's say, to the disruptions in education and training, which surely other colleagues today will speak more about. So we see this vast increase in number of young people that are not in employment, education, or training. And unfortunately, there is also gender dimension in this situation that is also quite appalling. So against this background, let me just share with you 3 facts that can perhaps help us visualize how technological change and other elements are affecting labor markets, particularly youth labor markets today. So the first fact is about the risk of automation, which peaks among young workers as they are more likely to be in more automatable occupations. Moreover, within the same occupation, the entry-level jobs held by young people tend to have a greater proportion of automatable tasks. These are tasks that rely less on social intelligence, creative intelligence, and perception and manipulation. Second, hope you can see the slides. But the second fact is about we find that higher education gives entry to less automatable jobs, which is great. And of course, we want to support further investments in education. And this is particularly the case that we see that having tertiary education as opposed to just upper secondary education, reduces the risk of automation by 8.8% among OECD countries and by 8.6% in other low and income countries. So from this graph, we can also see that conditional on one's level of education, vocational training gives entry to more automatable jobs. This doesn't mean that vocational training doesn't work. It rather points to the fact that vocational skills become obsolete more quickly than general education skills, and there is a need for regular upskilling and reskilling. So if we start thinking a little bit in our conversation about what are those skills that are in demand, there is also a conversation to be had about the importance of upskilling and reskilling some of those vocational skills that a lot of young people and, let's say, adults have received. So all in all, those with little education, lower secondary or less, are in high risk of automation at any age, and this risk is on average higher than that of any other educational attainment group. So our last fact is actually about the returns to tertiary education. So we are seeing actually that these returns are decreasing. While higher education reduces the risk of automation, it doesn't seem to be paying off for young people today, right? And this was particularly the case right before COVID when we published this research. So in fact, we have recorded a fall in youth wage inequality. This means that the wages of youth with tertiary education are actually converging to those youth with lower levels of education, right? So what the question for us is, why have returns to education fallen, and what, if anything, does this have to do with technological change? So we run a series of models, and we basically model the returns to education, to tertiary education, vis-a-vis innovation and technological change. And it turns out that they have very strong and positive effects on the returns to education. However, these returns are dampened by the rapid extension of the graduate labor force, which has grown vastly in most countries and outpaced the growing demand for graduate labor. So our takeaway from this fact is actually that advancing quality education is indeed catalytic to take advantage of digitalization and other changes, sort of mega trends we see around, to ensure continuity in learning and growing in the labor market. Yet we can only materialize those benefits if there is job creation, and this is precisely what Mega was mentioning before. So these benefits from education will only materialize if there is a thriving labor demand able to absorb those large numbers of young job seekers. So let me close with a few points. So obviously, I will not cover everything that is in this slide, but I did want to leave you all with a bit of a perspective on how important and urgent it is to strengthen the investments in the school to work transition. And that when we do that, let's think about 3 points, reference points. The destination is the first one, and this is where the demand side of the labor market comes in. So a lot of the macroeconomic policies, fiscal policies, sectoral policies. The second is about the paths and how we support young people in that path. And of course, the discussion today about the skills and what are the skills in demand is very crucial. This may vary across countries and the groups of young people that we are serving, but all in all, it really emphasizes the importance of skilling young people and developing the competencies that are in demand. And this requires, coming from the ILO, as you can imagine, this requires involvement of social partners and young people themselves in designing policies and programs. So let me emphasize here something that we have been working on recently, which is a new framework on core skills. So here I want to emphasize this because if anything I wanted to leave you today with is that indeed core skills is a universal need, and what we call core skills other people call soft skills, transferable skills, but it is the same basically framework. So we're talking about cognitive, non-cognitive skills, like teamwork, communication, etc. So core skills, as I was saying, is a universal need and one that is equally important for students and emerging workers in Asia as it is in Africa and North America. The difference lies, however, in the capacity of education and training systems to adapt and absorb these frameworks of core skills. For example, by modernizing teaching systems to ensure that core skills are part of the curriculum. So education systems indeed are still sadly outdated in many Asian countries. So to bring long-term benefits of core skills to all young people in the global south or in Asia, we need big investments in modernizing those education systems. So I talk about teacher training, curriculum, digitalization, but particularly with a focus on public education systems so that those who cannot afford private schools do not continue to be left behind, which takes me to the third set of actions that you see on the right-hand side that talk explicitly about inclusiveness and how we have a joint commitment to reducing the share of young people who are at risk of being left behind. So let me close there, and thank you so much, Megha, for the invitation and looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Susana, for laying out the context and sort of highlighting some of those big challenges there. I mean, you mentioned how, you know, the impact of COVID is disproportionate on women, which means now we're dealing with an even bigger challenge on harnessing the productivity of women. We're looking at automation cannibalizing jobs of young people. And you also mentioned how, you know, the return to higher education is declining while we're looking at skills like technology. I mean, technology by itself is skill-based. So, and then you sort of closed with some of the other challenges with respect to the education systems, not, you know, sort of looking at quality markers in the global south and problems of inclusion. So thank you for sort of laying it out there. And we sort of segue into the next segment, which is really the conversation with our panelists today, Professor Santosh Mehrotra and Ms. Rituparna Chakraborty. Let me introduce our panelists for the day. Professor Santosh Mehrotra is a visiting professor at the Center for Economic Development, University of Bath. Previously, he was the chairperson and professor of economics at the Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor Mehrotra has worked in the government in the Rural Development Division and later with the Planning Commission. He is a globally renowned expert on skills and employability. Welcome, Santosh. It's a pleasure to have you on our panel today. We also have with us Ms. Rituparna Chakraborty. Rituparna is the co-founder and senior vice president of TeamLease Services Limited, one of India's leading providers of human resource services. With a vision of putting India to work, the company, through Rituparna's leadership, enables young workers to have a formal job so that they can have secure wages, social security, and healthcare. She is an active and respected voice internationally on apprenticeships and employability more broadly. Welcome, Rituparna.
Thanks.
Let me now just jump into the first question for our panelists. And this is for you, Professor Mehrotra. Given your experience working on and with a number of countries across Asia, what do you think are the best practices broadly in terms of education and skills development?
So I'm going to divide my remarks into three parts very briefly. One, I'll look at good practices for government, second for the private sector, and third for private-public partnerships. But before I actually turn to that, let me just say that most skills acquisition in the global south actually happens in the informal sector. The vast majority of the workers are informal and they acquire their skills informally rather than formally. And a very important reason for that phenomenon of the informal sector being as large as it is other than the fact that formal sector is not generating enough jobs, is that, as Susana rightly pointed out, a vast majority of our workers actually young people come with very poor quality education. So they end up acquiring their skills also informally in the informal sector. Having said that, let me turn my attention to a subject on which I've written, which is good practices in the Asia region, which we can all learn from. So let me turn to government. Well, first of all, technological change, if it is to be inclusive, ideally should be driven by an industrial policy. In East Asia, there was an industrial policy in almost all countries. Not quite true in South Asia, not quite true in Latin America, and not true in Sub-Saharan Africa, and not true in most of the global South. This is surprising and in fact to some extent shocking, because 100 countries post-2008 global crisis, economic crisis, have adopted industrial policy. Because an industrial policy adopted by the government enables technological change to move in a direction and in a manner which is inclusive, meaning it generates jobs. Point one. Point two, most TVET systems, especially in many of Asian countries, especially in South Asia, tend to be government-driven. Now, government-driven and government-financed TVET systems are supply-driven. By contrast, the successful TVET systems, the training systems, are demand-driven. And they are demand-driven if they are industry or employer-driven. So one implication is how much practical training is part of, let us say, training TVET in South Asia. Not enough. That's the evidence from across much of South Asia. A lack of sufficient practical training. And in East Asia, this was not the case. The interesting point here is that in most of East Asia and Southeast Asia, there was an industrial policy that was driving the job creation of manufacturing export-oriented jobs, which absorbed the labor force. In other words, jobs were being generated for those leaving agriculture. And aligned to that was a TVET policy and an education policy which enabled the human resources to be created for those manufacturing jobs to be filled. This is the second, I think, good practice. The third thing is that the way South Asian governments in the last 15 years have enabled the private sector to mushroom in the whole TVET space, what has happened is that the government's capacity to regulate these private training providers is very limited. One dimension of this, emergence of private sector, which is not very well regulated, is a government-driven effort to initiate what is called a national vocational qualification framework. That means you try and regulate by putting in place a vocational qualification framework. In South Asia, for instance, Sri Lanka has one. Bangladesh is working towards one. India has been trying to put in place one for 17 years. But that's sort of putting the cart before the horse. I know time is limited. I won't say more than that. Let me turn to some other ones in the interest of time. A fourth problem with most TVET systems in our part of the world is finding teachers, instructors with industry experience. If industry is directly involved in the TVET system, and I'll come to that in a minute, then finding teachers will be easier. A fifth issue is your TVET system providing regular training for instructors, industry training? Do they have industry interface? Do they themselves ever, see the face of a factory or a services sector? Before, since time is limited, I'll quickly turn to what the private sector's role could be, should be. There are two main roles, or two sets of roles. One, what are the forms of industry participation And I think you see for these forms of industry participation in the TVET system, if you want a demand-driven, a practical training-driven TVET system. What are the forms? 1, curriculum design. 2, providing instructors. 3, provision of internships and apprenticeships. 4, certification, in their involvement in certification, not just governments doing the certification. And finally, help in placement, the placement counseling. Now, all of these 5 things requires state intervention, but state incentivizing private providers to actually offer training and offer instructors in engagement and curriculum design, etc. The second, point I want to make about private sector participation is that there are a very small number of enterprises as a proportion of all enterprises, in any case, which are formal. And within that formal sector, only the large enterprises offer any enterprise-based training, in-house training. The vast majority of small and medium enterprises do not. Now, there's a strong contrast in this regard between, South Asia on the one hand, and East Asian countries. Very strong contrast. I could show this by numbers, but I won't. And I'll close with the final point about financing TVET, which ideally should be a joint responsibility between enterprises, the private sector, and government, because that is the only way that you're going to get an industry-driven, demand-driven system. And the Latin Americans have actually mastered this institutional mechanism, the levy-based system, on which I have a separate paper in Economic and Political Weekly, which you can read. But essentially, the model is this. I'll be surprised if Argentina doesn't have it. Brazil has it, and most Latin American countries have it. That enterprises pay a levy which goes into a sectoral fund, and this sectoral fund is used to actually train workers for that sector, for all enterprises in that sector. So, firms don't have to necessarily have training infrastructure and training human resources for themselves. The institutions actually provide that training, but the funding is coming from the state, from the enterprises. And something similar happens in Korea and Malaysia and Singapore, but much of South Asia doesn't have this. This is an absolutely critical need if we want to ensure a demand-driven system for the formal sector. I might not have said, this is my last sentence, I might not have said anything about technological change, because my last sentence is the following. The technological change is that's in Industrial Revolution 4 driven, is going to impact Asian jobs to such a minuscule, such a minuscule share of such jobs will be impacted that in some ways, if you haven't solved the problems that I've just been talking about, you're only going to exacerbate the problems as IR4 begins to spread. And IR4 in the economy that we are now experiencing post-COVID is not going to spread that rapidly, not that much outside of China, Korea, Japan. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Mehrotra. Your point about how government finance systems are supply driven, but those run by industry are demand driven is interesting, and where you clearly say that successful systems are demand driven. And this is perhaps one of the areas where privatization can actually work to the benefit of all. And your points on engaging the private sector seems to be fundamental to the success of this trading model. Thank you for your thoughts. Moving on, if you look at the labor markets across Asia, including India, We face a conundrum, where on the one hand, we're told that the economy is not generating enough jobs to absorb the large and growing youth populations. And on the other hand, we have employers and firms that seem to be saying they're unable to find the right kind of workers to meet their needs. And one clear reason seems to be that there is a mismatch between the education and skills that many young people acquire and those that are in demand by the labor market. So my question is to Rituparna, if you could shed light on what is the industry perspective on how to fix this mismatch?
Thank you so much for having me. But before I start, I think I should spend a few seconds making a case in terms of why I qualify to be part of this discussion. I work for a people supply chain company who has a real-time view of the agony and ecstasy of the labor market. Of course, in the last 17 months, more agony than ecstasy. And we as a company are trying to solve three problems. First is the matching problem, which is essentially connecting supply to demand. Second is the repair problem, which is essentially, how do you repair the current deficiencies? India is one of those countries who suffers from high level of subsistence employment, in spite of there being a large number of graduates, and yet we struggle with this problem. And hence repair is one of those problems we are trying to fix. And the third problem is how do you prepare supply for demand? I think we've had fair amount of success in the first two problems. The second one is obviously a much longer battle in a country like India. But having said that, we are at it. We set up India's first skill university in our attempt to solve for the last problem. Now, to just coming on to the specific question that you've asked, Megha. I mean, at present, skills and working methods are transforming at a rapid pace. And as a consequence, there is a huge diversity between the skill set required and the skill set the candidate actually possessed. I mean, that's essentially the point I was trying to make about subsistence employment. In this transformation, the current knowledge of skill sets are becoming redundant and out of date. As Peter Drucker rightfully said, the only skill that will be important in the 21st century is the skill of learning new skills. Everything else will become obsolete over time. So as per the latest economic survey, around 12 million job seekers enter the job market in India every year. As per the forward-looking research, which TeamLease, I think it's a legacy research we've been doing for a while, an employment outlook report for just the current quarter of FY22, healthcare, pharmaceuticals, information technology, education service, e-commerce and tech startup, etc., are fast-paced sectors, and there is a high demand for a skilled workforce in these sectors. So employers in many, and of course, this is weather of the moment, clearly. Today's weather of the moment is this, and there is a certain set of skills that are required by these sectors. Employers in many sectors are betting big on innovation and making smart investments in newfound job roles that will stand them in good stead in near and not so near future. And I think this whole thing resonates well with what Susana presented just a while back. Technology startups are seen to be occupying the front row seats in the spectacle of innovation. Skilling is all about having a pragmatic approach to problem solving. And based on, again, a recent survey, which is on learning loss, I think we recently released it, almost 84% of the respondents said that their upskilling initiatives landed them in a better job or a better position. 75% took at least one upskilling course during the pandemic. 66% believe that they missed out on something substantial as they didn't upskill themselves, and 53% of the respondents said taking an upskilling initiative influenced their salary hike. We're entering a phase where there is a global shortage of tech talent. The digital skill gap is already hampering digital transformation, and that gap is widening. So according to a NASSCOM report, demand is increasing rapidly for emerging technologies. I think we all know, big data, analytics, cybersecurity, robotics. it's a long list. I think in order to position India, and I am somebody who's probably most qualified to only speak about India and not beyond, as the talent hub of the new emerging technologies while fixing the skills mismatch, businesses will need to build a talent pipeline for the future and enable the existing workforce to get reskilled. Employers can look into skill testing, which will allow them to gauge the difference between skills their employees possess and the skills they expect employees to have in order to stay on top of the evolving workplace efficiency. I think one of the forms of skilling could be to put fresh hires in the formal education, and another would be an appropriate training plan for lateral hires. An optimum blend of these two methods would actually ensure that employees learn quickly while giving a skilling cost advantage to the employers. Also, standardization of job roles or following standard operating procedures to perform jobs can fast track reskilling. While thinking about education, COVID-19 has proven to be an X-ray of India's education system, exposing pre-existing fractures that need healing. India has 3.74 crore students enrolled in over 51,000 higher education institutions. The gross enrollment ratio has been stagnant at 26% for the last 3 years, while 46% of the students attending government colleges, 24% attending government aided, and 26% attending private colleges. So the National Education Policy of 2020 set the target of 50% for gross enrollment ratio by 2035. And that needs a leap in skill competencies of students because unemployment and unemployability of graduates are higher than that of other youth. So linking higher education degrees to learning by doing and learning while earning of apprenticeship will make higher education more inclusive and demand-driven. Enough students and employers now recognize the value of apprentices. The binding constraint is regulatory change. The new implementation of the National Education Policy has been welcomed by many international universities, but we must reduce the implementation timeline of this policy from 15 years to 5 years. I think my summation of the last bit that I spoke essentially is a lead on to what Professor Mehrotra just now alluded to in terms of how we can make employers an ally and drive this agenda of skilling. Finally, we need to create the skills which are in demand, which are in response to the demand of employers. And we feel that this probably will be the best way forward to get this plan executed in the true sense. So I don't know whether that answers the mismatch question or not, but probably just the beginning.
No, thank you, Ritu. No, I think the perspective that you brought in terms of both from the side of the industry, and you did share from the perspective of the youth, of those already in the workforce, as well as sharing broader level aspects about the NEP 2020 and the concept of apprenticeships, which also could provide a bridge. So at this point, Professor Mehrotra, you had touched upon aspects about the East Asian model where you derive some of those best practices, but I just want to dig a little deeper, wherein and I know you've written about the Chinese model, wherein China has moved its economy to higher value-added activities. If you could just shed a little bit more light specifically on what role did skill development and the Chinese model play in this trajectory? So just going a little deeper on that.
I would just begin by repeating what I said last time, many of the points, and I will exemplify them with China. You see, China had an industrial policy, it had an education and a TVET policy which was aligned to that industrial policy. So this is point one. You search around in South Asia, or Latin America, how many countries have both an industrial policy and an education and TVET policy which is aligned to it. Second, let's learn from China what not to do also. China is the factory of the world. It's a manufacturing superpower. So is Germany. Do you think either of them had or have still a national vocational qualification framework? No, they still don't have it. They might be thinking about it now, but they built this system without a vocational qualification framework. And I say this, I should tell you, as someone who was asked by the Ministry of Education in our country to actually draft the basic document, which is today called the National Skills Qualification Framework. Very poorly and implemented, it's another matter. The point is, Sri Lanka has gone about it, Bangladesh is going about it, India has been going about it, with to what avail, really? Because the main reason why I even agreed to do that for the government of India was it might bring everyone together, all the stakeholders together on this subject. Okay, so I want to emphasize, China still has no national vocational qualification framework, point 2. Let me turn more micro from this macro level. Third, you know, Tibet instructors in China are required every year to spend a month in an industry or 2 months every 2 years in an industry, upgrading their skills and acquiring practical training. You tell me which countries in the world expect that? Point 3. Point 4, curriculum. I talked about curriculum design and the importance of industry. You know how the Chinese, a vast country, much bigger than most of the ones that we are talking about here. You know how they go about doing their curriculum for the senior secondary vocational students across the whole country? They have 3 components to their curriculum design. 1, a general academic one, which is national in scope, constituting 1/3 of the curriculum. Second, a national in scope vocational dimension for vocational training across the country. And third, the remaining third is vocational, but determined by local government. In other words, in order to respond to local demands, to local industry needs, there is this. This is a one-party dictatorship. And still, this kind of flexibility exists. Let me give you another China example. After all children complete 9 years of general academic education, they undertake an exam at the end of 9 years. They are then streamed into vocational or to general academic stream. You know what the share of the Tibet stream is of students in the senior secondary level? 48%. Nowhere in the world will you find this a comparable share. 48%. And one very important reason is that they get a stipend. The general academic students don't get a stipend. So you say, oh, it's not aspirational, it's not aspirational. You keep talking, you know, in the rest of the country, in our country or in other countries, oh, vocational education is not aspirational. How do you make it aspirational? You make sure that you provide them the stipend and quality training and industry engagement so as to ensure that they get jobs. And finally, I would close by saying, China has a Tibet law, national Tibet law. Germany has a national Tibet law. You ask around in Asia or Latin America, how many countries have a Tibet law which specify what the role of industry is, what the role of providers is, what the role of students and teachers is, a Tibet law. Let me stop there.
No, thank you, Professor Mehrotra. That was very insightful in terms of, you know, the lessons, you know, where you said what one should learn and what one should not. I mean, what we can learn as to what not to do. But very interesting to note some of those lessons that we can learn in terms of the legal backing, in terms of the incentive structures, the training models that you had mentioned earlier as well, and criticality of industry's participation across various aspects, be it design, training, and then you finally spoke about the whole financing model as well. So thank you very much. I will now direct a question to Susana. We'd actually wanted to ask you about how can we enhance access to skills for women in a way that enable them to productively participate in a 21st century labor market. And then, your first slide spoke about how, COVID-19 has sort of affected young women disproportionately. So, it becomes all the more critical to sort of look at that angle. So if you could just throw some light on your take on this.
Yes, thank you, Megha. So I mentioned before an emphasis on soft skills, right? And when I talk about soft skills, I want to also call your attention to the fact that we are trying to go a little bit beyond the sort of typical teamwork, communication, the 5 main skills that have been recognized over the past years. And we have integrated some of those mega trends. So one of the things we are pushing, particularly in a quest for gender equality in the labor market, is for greater investments and efforts to equip young women with digital skills, as well as skills for green jobs. So these 2 elements, in our view, these are critical to ensure that that there are some niche opportunities for women to succeed, to build up some of these main, let's say, growing sectors with great potential to create jobs. Now, talking about how many people, and I say young people, are in the informal economy, as Professor Santosh mentioned before, I would also like to emphasize that some of the evidence when it comes to youth employment, and when we analyze what works for youth employment, one of the things that had worked quite successfully for young women is acquiring skills in, let's say, is focusing on the space where these skills are. So we often talk about, we were talking about public education systems, but there is also opportunity to combine these systems with clubs of young women that come together and learn. And this is, let's say, a safe space for them to share and for them to let's say, start building up skills that, even though will not translate immediately into labor market outcomes, it will slowly and surely start showing greater empowerment, lower maternity rates, new pathways for young women to go back into education, etc. So this, of course, then is combined with mentoring, coaching, and other support services that we can deliver. And I know Rituparna mentioned the matching issues. So I want to emphasize here that, be it for women or men, I think one of the things, as we also talk about modernizing education systems, is also talking about modernizing employment systems and making sure those employment systems are really connected to the education system, so that there is indeed a demand-driven approach in the skilling, upskilling, reskilling. And that means improving how the matching is being done. And I understand there are private and public delivery services in this context. So building sustainability in employment services so that they rightly connect young people and other job seekers to vacancies in the labor market is crucial. And how we do that, it is also crucial to make sure that lessons are internalized by the public system and can gather, let's say, greater sustainability in the shorter and longer terms. Thanks.
Thank you, Susana. Going back to Ritu, I have a question for you. I mean, the world of work today lies at the intersection of so many large-scale transformations, and the speed and scale are absolutely unprecedented. So we're looking at transformations in technology, which we've spoken about, and now we have forces like the pandemic. And these are changes that are going to reshape the nature of work for generations to come. So in your opinion, how do you think we can best prepare children and young people for a world of work in which the rules of the game are constantly changing?
So I think in today's world of work, machines will perform tasks they are better suited to perform than humans, such as computation, data analysis, and logic. Whereas functions requiring emotional intelligence, empathy, compassion, and creative judgment and discernment will expand and be increasingly valued in our human culture, in our workplaces. Tinkering, invention, problem solving, entrepreneurship, and leading change must be emphasized, not just acquiring vocational skills and landing a job. And I can assure you that I personally am a big proponent of vocational skilling and making sure that people have a job rather than no job. But I think one of the things that pandemic has taught us is that that is probably not sufficient for us to rely in a world today where there can be accidents around the corner, like the pandemic. And hence, we have to, along with that agenda of vocational skilling, also focus a little beyond. This will inevitably result in more economic dynamism, more entrepreneurship, and more jobs and self-reliant jobs. Work is moving rapidly away from fixed jobs, as we know them, towards gigs and projects. Careers will look less like tunnels from which you emerge 30 years later, and more like navigating a maze requiring more of us to see ourselves as freelancers and entrepreneurs. Many industries are now looking for skills to digitize and automate processes and have generated a growing demand for professionals with specialized skills such as digital adoption, data analysis, AI know-how, and automation, plus delivery agents and warehousing managers on the delivery front. So there is a lot going on. So even if I need a delivery agent or a warehouse managers, there is an implicit requirement and need for these people to understand how to read data or how to make decisions based on something that a tool surfaces in front of them. In fact, tech jobs with super specialized skills are marked by employers as indispensable and are commanding a premium salary. I mean, that's also a recent survey which took us by surprise. During the second wave in the first quarter, while so many sectors were affected, there were these specific jobs which were commanding like almost 11-12% increments or revisions. So quite astonishing. Especially in the financial sector, skills and demands are in digital banking, blockchain, artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, cybersecurity, I think, and the works. So when an individual performs a variety of tasks, only a part of it can be fully automated, thus driving scope for growth. This is not limited to blue-collar workforce, but extends to all types from bottom to top level employees. These principles will aim at creating new types of work, and people need to upgrade to stay relevant. The nature of skills needs an upgrade to maintain balance, but we are still intertwined with the human workforce to drive the technology and vice versa. A very simple example in this context to give perspective, because of the pandemic today, we all order from e-commerce websites instead of going to the retail stores, which led to fewer people in stores, but more delivery personnel to get commodities from a location A to B. This is the transition that technology is bringing about. So a glance at the present Indian education system brings to light that COVID-19 has disrupted every rule of teaching, campus life, curriculum, and assessment. This has painful consequences. A survey that polled Indian university leaders and students suggests COVID learning losses of between 40 to 60%. This is double the estimated losses in the rich G5, G7 countries. India's Higher learning loss is primarily because of two digital divides, one between students and the other between Indian and global universities. Students need internet connectivity and devices, which many didn't have. So in the 2017-18 NSSO, which is a national sample survey, reported that only 24% of Indian households had internet access, and only 12.5% of the households of students in India have internet access at home. Only 41% of the students in urban areas and 28% in rural households have internet access, and 55% of university students are in rural households. So of the 5 million university students who stay in hostels, 48% don't have internet access at home. India must accelerate the Digital India initiative to blunt the digital divide among the poor, rural areas, and the disadvantaged communities. So a new world of organization is being driven by a lower life expectancy of large companies, and in a world where Google knows everything. Knowing is useless, and the key skill is learning how to learn. So all these changes mean that employers and employees will have to adapt. So the last 10 years of focusing on skills have taught us, and young India should note, that success needs 5 design principles: learning while learning, learning by doing, learning with qualification modularity, learning with delivery flexibility, and learning with signaling value. Thanks so much, Megha.
Thank you, Ritu. That was so well articulated. Thank you for your response. We have a member of the audience, Alia Khan, who has a question to the panelists. Over to you.
Thank you, Megha. I'm a labor economist from Pakistan, Islamabad, where I used to teach in a large public sector university, retired from there, and I'm currently doing policy work on labor-related issues. My question is about real-time data on labor force statistics. Now, both in India and in Pakistan, the labor force survey, which is the basic source of labor force statistics, is carried out at best annually. And that too gives the stock figures. Now, what kind of databases or data portals do the panelists foresee, which will sort of connect all the issues that have been raised in this discussion regarding which are jobs that are, at more or less risk of being automated, which components of a job are going to be automated, and then sort of linking it to the pool of workers, which would have to be either skilled anew or reskilled. And also, if I can bundle in the state versus federal issue. I mean, Pakistan has tried instituting labor market information systems at the provincial level, but again, they were not real-time information systems. So is there any thinking on these lines? And thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to ask a question in real time.
Thank you, Alia. Professor Mehrotra, will you take that question?
Sure. Thank you, Alia, for that question. And it would be nice to be able to see you. It's been a long time since I've seen you. Let me say the following. In India, I can speak with some authority about India. We have the annual labor force survey now for the last 3 years. In addition, we have a subsample of the annual labor force survey for the urban areas. So quarterly, we get data on a regular basis. And this has been made possible, the annuality of it, the quarterly survey has been made possible because all the data is now being collected through a computer-assisted process. So when the enumerator is in the household, he actually has a tablet and the data can be fed in and it's automatically cleaned and it can be generated quite quickly Secondly, in India, we have a large private sector organization called the Center for the Monitoring of Indian Economy, which does a panel across the whole country, 3 waves every 4 months. So you have regular data emerging from across the country, and that's a fairly reliable source of information. However, you know, the kind of granularity of the questions that you were raising, those are still not being addressed, unfortunately. It's a pity. I've been making a case to the National Sample Survey Organization in India that they should do a separate survey, which is focused exclusively on skills. It's not that there aren't questions in the annual labor force survey, and those are there, which gives you a sense of what is happening, but not sufficient. It's not good enough. Honestly, for at least large countries like yours and ours, it's not possible to collect data on skills on nationally represented example. Having said that, I'm sure you have it in Pakistan. In India, there is Naukri.com, and there are other such websites which actually have a vast amount of data which you can mine, which can be used to sort of get to the kind of demand and the kind of supply that is there. Let me stop there.
Megha, can I just add to that?
Please go ahead.
So, I mean, just to add on to what Professor has already shared about India, but you know, there are 3 things on this particular, because earlier you raised the point which I think the ayatollahs of our policymakers are also struggling with, in terms of how do we have real-time data around labor markets. So the challenge in India today is that the different data points which are being collected, and which is essentially what also means our regulatory cholesterol. However, they are collected in a scattered manner across organizations, across different states and centers. So one of the recommendations that we've been having, and by the way, each one of them have different systems and portals which are not connected amongst themselves. So one of the recommendations that we've been making to the government is that we need something called a unique enterprise number. Like India has for individuals something like a unique individual number, which is Aadhaar. We have been recommending that there should be a unique enterprise number. Why? Because for any organization to just survive and grow in India, there is a minimum of 27 government identification you need to procure. And each one of them have certain compliances linked to it. What we are making sense is that while the world is talking about data science, while the world is talking about data mining, the government has access to precious data, but government is not doing anything about making intelligent decisions using that data. So all the information and insights about labor markets and about what are the trends, what organizations are succeeding, what organizations are failing, what kind of people are being hired, these data exist. It's just that no one's looking at that data. And if we can unify them into one single portal, I think it will get streamlined. Of course, it's easier said than done, but we can make a beginning. So that's a number 1 suggestion on that front. The second, which is in terms of the aspect of skilling and how do you have relevant skilling? You know, any kind of forecasting tool around skillings where you're trying to compute information through different organizations has a lag. So by that time, the information is made cohesive and is presented. Look, the industry is looking for the skills. Industry moves on, and India has struggled with it. So India had National Skill Development Corporation, which has been doing that mechanism. But by the time they manufactured those skills, industry has moved on. So our recommendation is massification of apprenticeship, because if these kids are embedded in organization, their ability to absorb changing demands and skills will be much higher than anything else. And then maybe the sector skill councils or employers can just do a top up of whatever classroom interventions that they possibly need. So I think those are the two primary points that where we stand in terms of data. And the third point is that finally, at some point, we need to democratize labor information. So if just the labor aspect and not other compliances can be subsumed under one labor code, we will emerge as a much prepared and better country when it comes to having data through which we can make valid or valuable decision making. So, but there is one thing that the government has done is that there is something called a National Career Services. So while we have a Naukri, which is a private company, or we have others, like we have our own job site, the National Career Services attempt is to put all employment exchanges in India through one portal where essentially there is transparency between job seekers and employers in terms of the skills on offer and the jobs on offer. So that's something which has been launched recently, which is taking baby steps, but I think it has the right vision.
Thank you, Ritu. So we're nearly out of time. So if I can just ask Professor Mehrotra and Susana, if you have any closing comments, any key takeaways from this conversation that you'd like to emphasize, as the need of the hour when it comes to skills training in such a rapidly changing environment. So over to you.
Ritu, you go first.
Thank you.
I have spoken enough. Now it's you and Susana.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, no, thank you, Megha. I think lots of takeaways and a lot of learning from me about the region. So it's been great, and thanks for the insights about India. On our end, we want to emphasize the importance of investing both on the supply and the demand side of the labor market. I think this conversation has been very productive in that regard, so that we don't disregard one side, because as you said, investing only on skills it's not only inefficient, but it will lead to perhaps further frustration among young people who will not be able to find jobs. So our call is, on the one hand, balancing supply and demand intervention, and on the other hand, making sure that as we discuss all these issues about policies, that we explore the opportunities to integrate the voices of young people in those conversations. And we were just talking about data, and this is precisely one of the missing links in that data, no? That even it's already hard to get primary data or information about skills. It's even harder to find information about youth perceptions and aspirations, and how these different trends and the skilling fits those aspirations and perceptions. So we have carried out some work in this regard that I'll be happy to share with you, Megha, afterwards, as regards to those integrating aspirations within different modules. And and we at the moment we are carrying out a global survey with Ipsos about what is the impact of COVID-19 on employment and work. So one of the elements that we are pilot testing, particularly for Africa, is about these perceptions and aspirations of young people and how the pandemic has shaped or impacted those elements. So it's perhaps, as Ramiro said at the beginning, let's try to find a different way of looking at things. I think that gives a lot of power to how the South can look at solutions, youth employment solutions, labor market solutions, skilling solutions differently by being open and integrating different views. So thank you very much for the invitation, and it's been great. Thanks.
Thank you. Professor Mehrotra, over to you.
Right. I'm going to make just one general comment about how to ensure employers actually begin to engage in a much bigger way. I'm obviously talking about organized sector formal employers. And I conceive of this in two phases. The first phase is where governments actually incentivize the private sector, the employers, to come in and actually engage with the TVET system in the 5 ways that I mentioned. Curriculum design, providing actual instructors because our systems are short of instructors. Third, providing internships and apprenticeships, as Ritu was rightly emphasizing. And fourth, certification, and fifth, placement. The government's role is to incentivize the private sector to come in to do this. Once a system of this kind of incentivization is put in place, which will bring in the SMEs as well. The large corporates, you don't have to take care of them. Large corporates are going to come in. And the second phase would be where you actually, the government thinks seriously about putting in place a levy-based system that I talked about. 62 countries in the world have such a levy-based system. And it's running very successfully. I mean, to varying degrees of success, as Ramiro and I have been discussing in Latin America. But the point is, it's a far superior system to anything existing today. That's the point that I think people need to understand. 62 countries. Surely the policymakers there are not fools. We need to think about a system whereby a levy goes into a fund, which then funds private providers, private employers to actually do the training themselves. Because as I'm saying repeatedly, an employer-based system, a private finance, private managed system is always superior to a government managed system. If we were to move in this two-phase manner, there is hope. Otherwise, I don't believe there is a great deal of hope for even those who are getting skilled today to get jobs, which are in any case slowing in the post-COVID era, everywhere around the world.
Thank you. Ritu, we just gave you a breather, so please, your final thoughts before we
No,
close.
I think I've said enough.
All right. Okay, so in which case, thank you very much. It was such an invigorating conversation, especially like I was sharing with Professor. I'm new to the domain, and it was just so much to chew on. So thank you, Susana. Thank you, Professor Mehrotra. Thank you, Ritu, for joining us, and to the audience who've been part of this panel today. A quick reminder: this is part of a larger series on the future of work in the Global South. So do stay tuned for more such conversations with our panel of experts. Thank you.